My name is Amatullah Hunt and I will be your instructor for today. And in this class we're going to be looking at free verse poetry. We're going to be looking at definition, characteristics, some example of free verse poetry, and then we're going to look at writing free verse poetry. And as we all know, there are different types of poetry. We have the spoken word poetry, we have elegy, we have epic, we have haiku, and many more where that came from. But today we're focusing on free verse poetry because it is the simplest form of poetry you can write. And as a learner, as someone that's beginning to write poetry, it will be the easiest thing for you to start with. It's not that it's so simple, but it's just easier than the rest of the poems. And I'm going to tell you why right now. So, what is free verse poetry? Now, free verse poetry is a type of poetry writing that does not adhere to rules guarding poetry. Now, I'm going to read a definition by a very, very amazing person, which is myself, by the way. Free verses are poems that have no patterned rhyme or rhyme scheme, no set meter, no rhythm or any particular structure at all, giving poets the freedom to set their own rules, the liberty to change their minds at any point of the poem. Amatullah 2020, yeah, that's me. Yeah. Okay, like I said, free verse is a type of poem that has no rules. It gives you that freedom not to always put rhyme or any kind of pattern structure at all. You know, rhyme, rhythm, meter, all those are free when you're writing free verse. Then, more about free verses. Its popularity stems from the belief that free verse is a poetry without rules. After all, it doesn't rhyme and doesn't have a meter. I think a lot of people find it difficult to write poetry because, you know, they have to rhyme. At the end of a word, like, you have to bring another word at the end to go with the one, and then when you go, you have to have a rhyme scheme. You know, we're going to talk about that in more classes, rhyme scheme, how it is done and stuff. But most poems have that. There's also meter. But when it comes to free verse, you don't have to do that. All those rules are gone. And the truth is, it makes it easier for you as a new aspiring poet to write poetry. The second point says it's not that no rules apply to free verse, rather the poet makes up the rules for each poem. Yes, as you write your poem, when you're writing your poem, you decide what you want to do. You even decide if you want to put rhyme in your free verse, because it's not like it doesn't have rhyme completely, but if you want to put it, if you want it to rhyme, you make up your own rules as you go for your poems. That is the liberty free verse gives you. And then free verse, done well, will have rhyme, though it may not have a regular beat. A variety of poetic devices may be woven throughout the piece. And like I said, you make your own rules. You decide whether it should have rhyme. So when you do it well, it will have rhyme, and it might have other devices of making poetry, but it might not have a regular beat. That is, the rhythm might not be regular. That is the only thing that free verse doesn't have. Then it may be more difficult to write free verse than any other form, simply because the poet has more decisions to make. Like I said, no rules doesn't mean that it's just easy. You know, like, you have to now be creative enough to make your poem good by making your own rules, setting your own parameters and stuff like that. So free verse might be difficult to write, might not be. It depends on you. And then with free verse, there is no pattern until the poet creates one. Like I said, let's move to the next slide. Characteristics of free verse poetry. Now, the first one says, it's free from rules guarding other forms of poetry such as rhyme and meter. If you're writing a haiku, you have to adhere to that 5-7-5 pattern. But when you're writing a free verse, you really don't have to. And if you're writing a poem that has to rhyme, you have to put that rhyme at each as you go. But when you're writing a free verse, you decide whether the next line you write has a rhyme or not. It's up to you. Then it may or may not rhyme. We said that already. If it doesn't rhyme, if it does rhyme, the rhyme scheme may be irregular. So you might decide to start with a rhyme and then stop, and then continue. You might decide to just, the first verse is a rhyme and then the rest no rhyme. It's basically up to you. Then should contain thought and intense feeling. Now, I think the first type of poem I wrote was a free verse poem. Why? Because of all these things that I said. I was starting out to write poetry and I just needed that freedom to make my own rules, not to force it, I have to write meter, alliteration, whatever. No, I needed that freedom and it was easy for me to go. So let's get to the next slide. Then, what do you need to write a free verse poetry? Now, decide where to break a line. In the middle of a natural phrase, at the point of great suspense, to stress a certain word. What this is simply saying is, you make the decisions where you put a break. For example, my poem, Despondence, there's this place where she said, okay, let me just give you a free verse. She conserved no love for him, but the damages he made were irreversible. She felt worthless and powerless. She was crippled. You see, there's a break there. The weight held heavy on the left side of her chest, and her heart felt as though it was punctured 10 million times with sharp pins from all angles, and she then cried. Like, I put the break at the end of a suspense. And she then cried. So I put my break at point of great suspense. So you decide where you want to put your break. Is it in the middle of a natural phrase, at the point of great suspense, or to stress a certain word? Then it should be rhythmic and musical rather than done off line. Just because we said you don't have to rhyme, just because we said you don't have to put meta and everything, doesn't mean that your poem should just be like reading a story. No, it has to be a poem. It has to have some kind of musical, make it some kind of fun for people, because it's a poem. It should give what it's expected to give. Then avoid using unnecessary words. Sometimes just because we are free, we think we can just bring everything. No, you have to be careful. Just remember you're writing a poem, not a story. So make it sound like a poem. Then try to incorporate alliteration or repeated sounds at the beginning of the words. That's an example of a poem, Golden Goose, but I don't have it here, so basically try to incorporate alliteration or repetition of sounds at the beginning or in the middle of writing your poem. Then experiment with repetition. Experiment. Then remember that the musical quality of free verse comes from internal rhymes within the same line. So always remember that the musical quality of a free verse comes from internal rhyme. Like we said earlier, just because it's a free verse doesn't mean it wouldn't rhyme. If you do it well, it will rhyme. So bring it inside your writing. Then end it with a bang. Then before we look at examples of free verse poetry, I want to give you a reason why you should start with free verse poetry as an aspiring poet. Now, free verse poetry provides an open and engaging opportunity for poets to express themselves without the constraints of more structured poetry. When students read and write free verse poetry, it is an excellent chance for them to connect with the roots of poetry and the beriddled expression of ideas, emotions, and opinions. Now, as a new writer in the blog, we welcome you and we suggest that you start writing with free verse poetry. Why? Because it gives you the opportunity to express yourself without those constraints other poems have. If you want to start with a haiku, you have to follow the structure. If you want to start with a sonnet, you have to follow the structure. If you want to, this just gives you that freedom to be a beginner. So this is why you should start with a free verse poetry. Now let's give examples of free verse poetry. This is an ode by Kelly Rooper. Beautiful brown liquid steaming in my cup, becoming a muddy river as I stare in the cream. The aroma that gives me courage, the flavor that tastes like hope for a better day, and the energy that renews my will to live. Tomorrow morning, we'll do it again, my friend. So this is a typical example of a free verse. And I did not hear any rhyme here. There is no rhyme completely. But it's a poem. You can see by the alliteration. You can see by the way the expression is. So we're going to look at the next one. Fog by Carl Sandburg. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city, on silent hunches, and then moves on. Simple. This is a free verse. No rhyme, no meter, just free, but a poem nonetheless. Those are just I have just 2 examples of free verse poetry, and then I think I have other examples that you could look at on my IG page. I have one of my most popular free verse is Queens and Heartbreak. It's a short poem, it's a free verse poem, and it's very, if you watch it, you'd see everything I'm trying to. The minute you start reading it, you understand that yes, it's a poem, but it doesn't rhyme, it doesn't have meter, it doesn't have any structure, but it's really nice. So while writing, just remember, make it something that people will want to listen to. Just don't make it dull, flat. Just because it's a free verse doesn't mean it shouldn't be good. And then there's Despondence also is a free verse poem. So I think that's all for today's class. Okay, but before we go, we're going to look at some exercises you can try for your free verse poetry as we're going. You know, at the end of every class, we give you exercises to try so that you could, learn. Make your own definition of a free verse poetry. At the beginning of this class, I gave you a definition that was mine. There are many definitions out there, but just try to make your own. Simple, and then you write it down. And then write a free verse poetry. It doesn't have to be long. It can be short like The Fog we just read, or it can be long like Queens and Heartbreak that I wrote. And then after that, you can tell us what difficulty you encountered while writing that poem. Those are the exercises we're going to try. Thank you so much for joining this class. It was really nice. When you do your exercise, please send it to our DM, or you can just send it to our mail, thenorthernprime@gmail.com, and we'll review it and make corrections for you and then send it back to you. And then don't forget to listen to our podcast on Echoes, ECHOESS, on Anchor, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. You can find it anywhere. And when you listen to the classes, they are more elaborate, not like this that are short like this. No, they are more elaborate and you can understand more. And then don't forget to tag a poet, tag an aspiring poet to this video, those that want to learn. These are free classes, and we're going to start our paid classes, which are more advanced than this, inshallah. Thank you.